Hello world and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at Atmosphere, and today we're going to be taking a look at Dapr on Azure Container Apps. Hi guys, today I'm going to talk about Dapr with Azure Container Apps. Now Dapr is a framework that is designed for creating microservices. The framework comes from Microsoft, so it is one that is well supported in the Microsoft community, but it works with a lot of different application frameworks in addition to the Dapr framework that itself. It's actually a fairly lightweight way of creating microservices using Docker containers. So you can basically write whatever service you want in whatever language you want. And as long as you have the conventions in your code, you can use many of the common libraries that are found in many of these common frameworks like Node.js or Python or .NET, whatever it might be. And you can kind of glue all of those together using Dapr. Now, what Dapr does offer is a lot of services that are common to things like microservices, like service discovery, state management, and things like that. So that you don't have to build a lot of extra code to manage a lot of those kinds of features that are typically found in microservice frameworks. Another thing that it gives you is secure inter-service communication so that you don't have to broker that connection between all of the services with the service itself. So if I'm writing a Node.js app, I don't have to import a bunch of certificates into that particular container. Rather, I can just communicate with what they call a sidecar container, and then that will then proxy the connection over a secure connection to another microservice in the same microservice suite. And vice versa, if somebody wants to talk to my microservice in Node.js, it will just use its sidecar container and it will encrypt the traffic. So it's basically mutual TLS, or MTLS as it's typically called, where all of the communication between all of the services running inside of a microservice suite are connected. So we'll go over this in a little bit more detail with a slide just to show you kind of how it works. And then I'll show you a working example locally. And then I'll put this up on Azure Container Apps and we'll see it in action. Let's go step by step about how this works. It's pretty straightforward. So I start off with a service, and that, like I said, that can be written in any language you want. It's not really a framework that you're going to import into your application. So you're going to be using a lot of the common frameworks, especially if you're using HTTP, that are part of the language. And so Dapr is really more about convention. So it will work with many of the common libraries, regardless of what framework you use. So it tries to be as agnostic as it can in that regard. So you can write whatever you want in whatever language you want. And so when you start your service, usually it's going to start up using a Dapr sidecar. And a Dapr sidecar is essentially just a container that gets started right alongside the primary service container. And when you configure this primary service container, you basically configure it to talk to this Dapr sidecar container. And that's going to happen over just a connection between these two different containers. They work as a pair for building out a service. And the Dapr sidecar container contains a lot of the infrastructure that it needs for doing a lot of the things that we're going to mention in just a second. But when you deploy it, this is what you end up with. Now, the service communicates with the Dapr sidecar, but what happens is another service needs to be communicated with by the first service. So this one right here needs to know how to reach this one. But before it can reach this service down here, what this service down here will do is register itself with a state management and service registry. And the service registry is part of what Dapr provides to all of the services that are running as part of a microservice suite. So basically, it's starting up another container, or rather a set of containers, depending on what scale you're using this at. And whenever a service instance starts, what it does is it says, here I am, here is my connection information. This is my IP address. And that gets stored in a service registry with a name. So this one might be service 2, and it's saying, here I am, I'm service 2, here's my endpoint. Now, what happens after that is when a request comes in, this service needs to know how to reach service 2. So what it's going to do is reach out to service 2 by way of the sidecar. So this service comes into this service right here, and this one is just communicating with the Dapr sidecar. It's not trying to use any kind of connection resolution outside of that Dapper sidecar. But the request is specified with a name of the service that it wants to reach out to. And it's basically an HTTP host header if you're using the HTTP protocol. And the Dapper sidecar sees that request and it goes out to the service registry and says, I need an instance of this particular service endpoint, and it's done by name. And then that returns back to the Dapper sidecar where that endpoint is going to be hosted. And so the Dapper sidecar then basically rewrites the request in a way to where it can then send that request down to this service down here by way of this Dapper sidecar. And it uses mutual TLS right here, which is basically a secure connection between these two so that the original service doesn't have to broker that. And so it rewrites the request, sends it down to this Dapper sidecar, and it basically undoes what this Dapper sidecar up here did and sends it back to this service down here as part of a unencrypted payload that this service then gets and then returns by way of the reverse of where it ended up coming from. And so that process is reversed. The response is re-encrypted and then decrypted here, and then it's sent back to the client right here once this service up here receives it. So this process is pretty typical of what you would see in a microservice suite. Now, this is very similar to what Spring would do or any other type of service mesh technology would do. This one just does it in a way that doesn't require that you integrate a lot of that into your original service. Rather, it just requires that you follow some conventions, and then the conventions will take care of the rest by basically abstracting that away and allowing you to basically remain agnostic in your service here, and then use the Dapper sidecar to do a lot of that heavy lifting for you rather than having to bake it into your application. And so all this really has to do is just worry about trying to figure out what I'm going to be doing in that service and then communicating with the Dapper sidecar for all of the state management and service registry that is going on up here. But all in all, it just kind of gives you a nice framework for doing a lot of those common things that you find yourself doing with microservice architectures. So let's look at some sample code here. I'm going to go to nanoindex.js here. And this is the sample app for my backend that I'm going to be using. I'm going to call this one Dapper1. And you can see that this is just a standard Node.js app. It's using Express, which is the built-in HTTP web server. There's nothing in this that's particular to Dapper. It's just basically listening for requests on whatever port I pass in on this environment variable, and it returns information about the host. So the host name, the type, the platform, etc. So it's a pretty straightforward application. So to start this guy up, I can just basically use the Dapper CLI, which I've installed on this. I'm SSH'd into a box that is a Linux host, and I'm going to just simply run the Dapper CLI, which I've already installed. I've already installed Docker too, and this is going to start this on my host here. And this will start up this on port 3001, which I told it to in the command. And then it's going to be listening to requests on that particular request coming into that port and the actual container that's running. So if I do another instance of my SSH here and log into that, and let's get into sudo -i, and let's get back to the place that I'm running all these demos from. And home/blaze/Dapper. And if I have a front end service here, this is where I'm running my front end from. So let's do nanoindex.js here. And this one is going to be using Dapper port if I pass it in, or it's going to default to that one. So in this case, I'm actually passing in some variables to this one, and it's going to default to that. But the way this one works, this is a little bit more nuanced than what we had before. So this is another Node.js application, but the difference between this one and the other one is this one wants to request something that is running on the other application. So the way that this one works is it's basically going to be listening to requests on Express. So again, using Express here, but it's using Axios, which is an HTTP client for Node.js. That's not something that's particular to Dapper. And it's basically just configuring a request using the conventions that Dapper requires. So the Dapper host is typically going to be a local host for that sidecar. So that's just basically telling this application where to find the sidecar, which is typically going to be localhost, or it gets passed on an environment variable here. And the port, you can either specify that or you can pass it in. And this one I'm going to be passing in a port variable. And so it's going to tell me to use that port. And so that's where Axios, the HTTP client, is going to look for that sidecar container. It's not doing any kind of HTTPS request for that. And so that is how it knows what to do. But because that other one is already running, it's going to be looking up that particular Dapr1 instance, which is the first case that we looked at, that first app we looked at called Dapr1. It's going to be requesting that using this HTTP header. So Dapr app ID is what we named that first app we started. So this is how the sidecar knows what to look for. And so it's going to go out to the service registry, grab an instance of Dapr1 and return that back to the sidecar. Then the sidecar is going to rewrite whatever this is requesting and go to Dapr1, get the data and return it back to this app. And this one basically just takes that and relays that back out to the calling host, which would have been which would be my web browser in this case. So it's going to call back into Dapr1, get the data, repackage it, and then send it back into a browser. And that is basically all this is doing, is just relaying that data that the other app returns. So it's just saying, what is the data that I'm getting? And that's what Axios is just basically simulating as a HTTP request here. So let's go ahead and start this one up, and then we can connect to it locally here. So let's go ahead and run this command using the Dapr CLI. And I'm going to use port 5000 in this case, and I'm going to use this app right here. And so this one is starting up, and so I can use a browser to connect to this one. So I've got a browser instance pulled up right here, and I'm going to go ahead and paste in that URL for that particular host. So that was running on port 5000, and this is the IP for my Linux box that I was connected to. So this should pull up the information that we saw. So this is that front-end application that we started, reaching back into the one that I called Dapr1, and then pulling that data back to the calling service and then relaying that back to my browser. And that's pretty much what we saw inside of the slide that we had, but it was using Dapr to orchestrate all of those service calls that we have. So this is the way it works with Dapr, and it's also the way it's going to work on container apps. So let's go in and deploy this to container apps and just see how it works there. So I already have here created a container app environment. Now this is basically just the parent object inside the Azure portal for running container apps. So container apps themselves are just basically a set of containers that you basically set up using an orchestration using the Azure CLI, or you can use the portal, and there's other ways to do it. It doesn't have to use Dapr, but I'm using Dapr today. And currently I don't have anything on this. I don't have any apps that are currently registered with this, but that's what I'm going to set up here. So it's basically using the container apps environment and choosing a log analytics workspace for all the logs from the containers and the environment itself. So to deploy this, I'm going to use the CLI again. So I have the CLI pulled up right here. I'm going to use a command from the Azure command line. So I've installed the Azure command line on this particular Linux box, and I'm going to use the container apps extension as a way to deploy this. So that's what this is. So it's not a part of the default packages that are, or rather extensions that are installed with the AZ CLI, but you can easily install that as part of just the extensions that are available to the Azure command line. And this one then will create an instance of an application. So what you need to specify then is the name of the resource. So that's going to be Dapr1, and that's going to be basically the way it shows up in the Azure portal, as well as the Azure Resource Manager is going to reference this as Dapr1. I'm also using the same name for the Dapr app ID, which we've already talked about. That's how the service registry will know what to look for whenever I look for Dapr1 instances. And this one I'm going to use port 3000, and I'm going to pass everything in as part of port 3000 as well. So this one is going to be using port 3000 instead of the other ones that I used, 3001 and 3002 for the local demo here. Now I want to expose this externally, which I can do that if I want. You can do it also internally. And I'm basically wiring this up to use different number of replicas. I'm basically saying I want 3 instances of this running by giving it, a min number of replicas and a max number of replicas. And that's because container apps can load balance across multiple instances of this particular app. So this is pretty straightforward for deploying this. I've already logged into the Azure CLI, and I'm basically just saying, deploy to this resource group, this environment here. And this is the container image that I built. I built the container image and pushed it to Docker Hub. You can use an ACR instance at Azure Container Registry or another one if you so choose. But this one is using just Docker Hub. And I pushed this one up there as Dapr1, and it's going to pull that image down locally and run it. So let's go ahead and start this one right here. And that's just going to create an instance of my application running on my container app. So now that will take just a second to create. And it doesn't immediately show up inside of the Azure portal, but we'll come back when that finishes. Okay, that's done. Now let's deploy the second one to this. And this is going to be basically the front end for that application. I'm going to call this one Dapr2. It's going to call back into Dapr1 using that code that we looked at locally. But the basic principle is the same, where I'm deploying something to a container app. And this one I'm going to call Dapr2 and choosing a containerized version of that code we looked at in Node.js for the front end that basically looks for the sidecar and then calls out to the backend service, which is called Dapr1, using that HTTP header. And this one is going to be using port 5000, and I only want one replica of this one. And this is a Dapr app, and I'm calling it Dapr2. All of the things on this one are pretty much the same, though. It's the same environment, the same resource group, and so on as the other Dapr app that I published already. And so let's go ahead and start this one. And this one will start on a separate host name as well as different ports. And we'll come back when this one finishes. Okay, that one's done. So now I should have 2 apps in the Azure portal as part of this deployment here. So let's refresh this and let's see if they both show up. I might only see one for now, but if I come into here and look at this, this should show both of them. So both of them are deployed. And I can click around on this to show you kind of what this looks like. So this one, if I look in revision management, it should show me a provision state, which it does. And this will show me the container. This is just all the parameters I passed in. Dapr1, you can see that's using that container that I told it to use. And Dapr1 backend, we should see 3 of 3 deployed, which is pretty much what we want, exactly as we told it to. And, Dapr right here, I've got the app port in the background for port 3000. This add the app ID of Dapr1. It's using HTTP rather than gRPC. So this is, again, using Dapr on this application. So this is the one that is my backend app that Dapr2 is going to call into. So if I come back over here to my container apps, I should be able to refresh this and see Dapr2 as a first-class resource here. But again, if I look at the revision management, it's provisioned. That means it's in a good state. I only have a different container there, Dapr2. This one should only have 1 of 1, which is fine. And ingress is basically coming into port 5000, which is what I expect. And everything else looks fine. So if I run this, then I should be able to hit this end and get information about this application here running on container apps. And because I have 3 instances of it, I can refresh this, and it's going to hit a load balance backend of that Dapr1 service. So this is calling hello from Dapr1, but I'm running it on Dapr2 right there. You can see in the URL that it's Dapr2. But this is the response from Dapr1 that Dapr2 is calling. So it's a pretty straightforward example. It's kind of a very happy path-like example, but it gives you a pretty good idea of how Dapr works with a container apps. And I'm going to be exploring container apps in a future webinar where I'll be talking about some of the other features, but I felt like I would go ahead and do this one so that I could talk about some of the cool things that you can do with Dapr. But I'm going to be looking at things like the kinds of storage backends you can use, as well as Dapr, and how you can use this for other kinds of applications as well in a future webinar. If you like this content, please consider checking us out online at www.winelect.com, where you can find several blog entries about topics related to Microsoft Azure and software development. And you can also subscribe to this channel by clicking the subscribe button below and then clicking on the bell icon to receive notifications when new content becomes available. Until next time, thanks.